All right. Let's go to the next slide, please. Welcome to today's community conversation. My name is Sean Hurley, and I'll be your community host. We are joined by the talented Dana De Filippi, and we're going to talk about Revit materials. Oh, we'll get to the lawyer stuff in a minute. I gotta give the non-fun legal stuff later. Community conversations are virtual meetups featuring expert speakers from across the community. Sessions range from deep dives, product tips and tricks, live demonstrations such as AutoCAD, Revit, Dynamo, all the good stuff. Insights, emerging trends, all different levels are invited to attend. We go from beginners to advanced depending on the topic. All right, the fun lawyer stuff now, Dana. All this says is, if we make any forward-leaning statements, talk about future things, they're not promises that any purchasing decisions are made on the product as they are now. And Dana isn't an Autodesk employee, but it'd be awesome if you were, Dana. But
good.
Yeah,
everything that I'm going to go over is cool with the.
The sample. You can say that we're going to have unicorns all over Revit, and it's okay. That's why we put in this legal disclaimer. So next, please, just the fun ground rules. Everybody's line is muted to reduce the background noise. Although we do invite you to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable with that. Just kind of gives us that pseudo in-person thing. But we will have that, next month at AU. We've got 3 community conversations there, in person and online. Sorry, a little ramble and rant on that one. I love it. Communication, the conversation is just that. So if you have any questions, ask in the chat or use the Zoom hand raising function down in the bottom right, and we'll call on you to unmute. Again, it is a conversation, so it's fun. The session is being recorded, and I'll post this in the next 24 hours up on the event page where you registered. And then it'll also be on YouTube, so you can share it with friends, family, friends, pets, whatever, social media. So, all right. And you're consenting to recording. I mean, that goes without saying, but anyway. All right, next, please. All right, the fun intros. I'm Sean Hurley, Autodesk Community Engagement Manager. I am a geeky technologist in Bend, Oregon. Dana.
And I am Dana De Filippi. I am a computational leader, really a BIM technologist at Smith Group. I help with all things Revit, really, when it comes down to it. But I focus on innovation and really making people more efficient in Revit. And so I also have my own YouTube channel to teach you to become more efficient in Revit, Dynamo BIM. So make sure you check that out, sponsored by Intel and Dell. And of course, thanks for Smith Group. They're really the source of all of this information that I'm sharing today. So I'm very grateful for them. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I am also a Hokie, Virginia Tech graduate. I studied actually interior and industrial design there. Graduated during the recession and was really grateful to learn Revit during that time. So quickly jumped into technology. So I've really always been the Revit girl in the office, which I'm completely cool with. So let's talk a little bit about really my heart, interior design, and how we can bring the focus to that with Revit and making Revit smart behind the scenes.
We've got one comment that you don't sound as loud as me. I am really loud though.
Are you? So. Okay, maybe is this better? I can also
really loud now.
Is that really loud? Okay. I guess maybe raising my voice.
I think that's fine, and we could all turn our volumes down if we need be. Okay. I just tend to talk really loud. Maybe I ruined it.
You got to turn it down when Sean's, and then up when I'm. Okay. Hopefully that's a better volume with it a little bit closer. Today, we're going to talk about a few different things, a few different approaches, and how we document finishes, because that's ultimately the end to the means, right? We're getting paid to document this stuff. How can we get it documented? But at the end of the day, have a model that is smart so that if our finish plan gets deleted on accident, we're not left with no information, right? Or all the information in the last submission. No fun, right? Having to go back and look at the PDFs for finish tags. Not something we want to do. We'll also talk about how we can work with schedules and legends. A little bit of a workaround there with just some Revit hiccups. I always joke if Revit was perfect at what it did, I wouldn't have a job, right? So we'll talk about some of those workarounds and how we can get around what Revit won't do natively and how we can use Dynamo even to make us more efficient. I have also shared those files, all of the families that we're going to talk about today, as well as the Dynamo files with Sean, because I'm sure that will be asked in the chat here in a second when I show which ones I'm going to be using. But we'll also try to create some of those tags together if we have time, which I think we will. So annotate. We are going to smartly annotate our finishes. You can see here, Revit text has a place in documentation, just not here. Typically, I like to say text is for, general sheet notes, those types of things that you're annotating, the typical notes that you want to leave in the column, not necessarily our annotations on the sheet or in the view, right? So we're going to talk about a lot of different annotations, even some that aren't shown here today, like legend components. We're going to talk about a little bit down the line. So a little bit of those families in terms of what's labeling our annotations, right? So we have a material tag, a room tag, and a wall tag that we have either created or edited from the Revit Advanced sample file. So we'll do that together today. You want to, you can follow along in the sample file. Should have that on your computer. I'll show you how to get there even. And a generic model component. It's really just a new family that I created. It's a little tile, essentially. I've given it a width, depth, and thickness so that you can control it in your project if you want. But really, it's ultimately to populate the schedule. We'll talk about that a little bit, as well as create some legend components from. We'll also talk about some Dynamo scripts. These four in particular, we are going to be in Revit 2023 using Dynamo 2.13. I've said that enough that it's not so much of a mouthful, but whoa, those numbers are so similar, right? So Dynamo 2.13 and Dynamo Player for Revit 2023. So first off, finish plans, right? And so we're going to jump a little bit here between PowerPoint and Revit 2023 in the sample file. Finish plans are typically how we document some of our at least typical finishes and maybe the placement of some of our accents. At least at Smith Group, and typically what I've seen through the industry is we use our rooms to document typical finishes. So you can see there I have the room selected in this screen grab in PowerPoint here, and you can see I have the finish parameters highlighted. So essentially here, if I go to annotate those through tag all, I've modified this room tag to include those finish parameters. So it's labeling those labels that I was highlighting in the previous image, right? So if we see here, none of those are populated. So my tag doesn't look like it has any additional parameters, right? But it does. You can see it's slightly offset from the center there. Doesn't have the question marks, which is actually kind of nice. But the next thing would be, how do we populate those parameters, right? We're going to talk about really two ways of how we can populate those parameters for, once again, our typical room finishes, right? Our wall, ceiling, base, floor, typical finishes. First off, and not many people surprisingly know about finish keys inside of Revit. When I go to create a schedule, essentially, I'm going to select a schedule of keys rather than of building components. And we're going to create this together in the sample file here in a second. And you can select any of the parameters you want. Instance parameters, typically room parameters, all of them are instance parameters. There are no type parameters with rooms. So any or all of the finished parameters. We'll talk about maybe why you'd limit some of these parameters in a second. But essentially, this starts to allow me to create groups of finishes.
Hey, Dana?
Yes.
We did have one comment. It sounds like there's a subtle difference. Joanna says room properties with this way, there's a problem with shafts, which usually don't have rooms, but we do have the wall floor finishes. So
interesting. This
yeah,
way with the problem with shafts. I've never had to annotate a shaft specific to finishes. That's not typically an area that is finished, or we would cover that in a general note, right? That says all shafts have these finishes associated to them. Maybe they have some sort of paint or architectural coating within the shaft. That would be covered in a general note rather than room by room.
Makes perfect sense.
Or shaft by shaft, right? But that's a total valid point, and thank you so much for pointing that out, Joanna. And really, once again, it really comes down to how we document things. So that would ultimately be the question that I would ask, either Joanna or someone who comes with me with these types of questions from the team. Hey, I've noticed that a shaft doesn't have these properties. I was like, well, let's see in the past how we've documented shaft finishes. Do we at all, or do we cover it in a note? Do we cut, if we actually do annotate shafts, room by room or shaft by shaft, then that would be a separate issue that maybe we should start to use rooms, if nothing else, because of the necessity of having this data. Just a thought. So with the finished keys here, we can see once with this schedule of keys has been created, we can essentially insert data rows. So you can see here, the example that I'm using is a finished key for office finishes, right? Maybe we have a key for back of house or restrooms, right? All of the finishes associated to a particular grouping, if they're the same, right? And once again, we can have all of these finishes included or just some of them. Maybe the only thing that's differing from these groupings is the floor, right? So thinking about what actually is going to differ from group to group, somewhat important when you're creating these finished keys. Once we've created this, we can then go back and you can see here, now I have room style that's going to associate itself to this key name. And that's actually an instance parameter of this schedule, would be the key name. In this case, it's room style. So you can see there's an additional instance parameter when I select my room. Once again, we're going to do this in the sample file here in a second. And once I do that, once I actually select office, you can see there all of my finish parameters have been filled out. You can see in this case, I do not have a ceiling finish associated. Maybe that's the only difference between all of my offices, right? Maybe some of them have ACT and some of them have a painted gym. Now, once I do that, once I associate a key, it's important to note, these are grayed out, right? You can see there that I can't change these values unless I change the key. I can go back to my key schedule here and change these values within the key. Those will automatically update any rooms that have this key value associated to them. So anything that has this office room style associated to it would automatically be updated. Or I could generate a new key, insert a new data row, and generate a unique key. Maybe there's a separation of, the principal's office or the administrative offices versus the educational offices, right? Whatever it might be. So let's go ahead and jump in to do that before we actually talk about room finish elements. So jumping right in here to the Revit sample project. If you can't find that, Guile, if you guys have too many files open from your recents, it's no longer displaying, you go to File and Open. all the way down here at the bottom. If you just hover down on that bottom arrow, you can see there, you can get to sample files. Nice little tip there coming to how you open up that sample file, which most of my content from YouTube is based off the sample file as well. So opening this guy up might be super familiar with this view here. I'm just going to actually go to the furniture layout plan because that sounds like a good place for finishes to be documented, right? Now, the very first thing that we're probably going to need to do is update that room tag, right? So that if we select a room here, like this office, which I know it's an office, we can actually label with our room tag these finish parameters, right? The base, ceiling, wall, and floor finish parameters. So we can do that after placement even. Go to annotate, tag all, select our room tags. Doesn't really matter which one right now. We're going to update that in a second. Hit apply, and we can see that those rooms get applied there. Those actually room tags get applied there to our rooms, right? We're annotating our room elements. Once I do that, I can then select the room tag and we can edit that family. Now, essentially, I just want to create an additional type. You can see there that if we go into our family types under the modify tab, that we actually already have a few different types, as you saw there when I was placing those under tag all. I want to have room tag with finishes. So I don't necessarily want to update the area or the volume within this specific case. I'm just going to take the volume, copy it, and paste it to the same place. In this case, now I have a new label. You can also go to create and place a new label, not text, a label. And essentially you can see it there when I hover over. This is going to create a label for the annotative symbol. Essentially, once again, annotating a parameter of the room. In this case, we want to update this label to have the finish parameters, right? So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that volume parameter and add in, before I do that, actually, I'm going to cancel out, and you can see here, I've done this before. I'm going to share these finished families. So that's why I know I need to change the vertical alignment to top so that it doesn't jump into the middle of the room tag for me, because I'm going to add a few additional parameters here. So that's all I've done here, vertical alignment to top. Edit this label, and I'm gonna go ahead and remove volume. And typically, we like to think about our finishes from, either the top to bottom or bottom to top, right? Now, in the case of our floor finish plan, a little bit of an alliteration there, versus our ceiling plan, we may not show the ceiling finish, right? We might have two different finish tags, one for our ceiling plan, one for our floor finish plan. You would essentially just need a few additional visibility parameters. I'm just going to create them all in one here. So base, floor, wall, and ceiling, right? I went, I guess floor would go before base there, right? So thinking from bottom to top. You can update these sample values as well, but ultimately we really do need to break these values so that they show up on their own individual line. The nice thing about doing this way is that if one of these values are not populated, you don't have a gap. Maybe you want a gap. Maybe you want them to be each in their unique place depending on what finish they are. Notice here that with the label, you can also add a prefix or a suffix. So maybe you want to add information alluding to this is base, this is floor, this is ceiling, etc. However you want to do that, right? You can annotate your room tag with the finishes as any way that you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK there. And once again, because we changed that to the top alignment, you can say it grew down, save me a little bit of time after the fact. And lastly, what we'll need to do is update our visibility parameter. You can see because I copied that volume label, it came with the label. So I cheated a little bit there. So I'm going to hit equals so I can update my label. I'm going to hit create new, show finishes. That's probably under graphics, so we can update that in a moment. And we want to leave that as a type parameter because once again, we're going to create a unique room tag type that shows finish data. All right. And once again, this is incredibly important because annotating, right? This is the root of annotating in Revit, creating labels that are annotating our parameter data. Whether it's a room tag, later we're going to show material tags or whatever else that you might be tagging. Walls, we're also going to show a wall tag. Now that I have these finish labels created, I can come back into my family types and create a new type with room tag with finishes. Hit OK. And I don't need my room number. Maybe I do. Yep, I do. And I'll show finishes. Hit OK. Nice little trick here. If we click over the preview visibility and we turn that on, kind of visualize what this tag will look like. Now that we have this type created with all the labels we need, we can load this back into our project and close it. You can save it if you need to. It will be saved into the model, but I recommend that this gets saved somewhere where others can use it, right? If you don't have this as part of your general templates, probably a great thing to modify the room tag to have that. So I'm going to hit no. I already have it saved. It's shared with Sean for all of you guys. We'll just go ahead and overwrite everything there. I'm going to right click on my room tag, select all instances, entire project. Well, I guess I should just do visible in view, right? I'm not sure exactly where all these room tags live. Visible in view. I have 31 room tags in this view, and I can update them to be with finishes. And you can see the volume just disappears there, right? I'm not labeling the volume with my finish tag, but other than that, nothing happens. And the reason that is because we haven't associated any data to our base, ceiling, wall, and floor finish parameters, right? Once I start to associate that data, it will start to populate under the tag. Probably will need to change this scale a little bit for all of those values to show up properly. One thing also is we may need to align these, right? So that certain elements aren't over top of others, right? These do automatically populate over the X. So in terms of that room, you could update the location of that X so that when you hit the tag all, it will automatically, oh goodness gracious, I did not want to do that. I don't like the drag upon, I usually have that guy turned off and the select on face, but just really wanted to move the X of the room. So the tag all will automatically default at the intersection of that X, right? So just a little tip there in terms of saving you time with that tag all feature. So the keys, now that I have those room tags placed, let's go ahead and create our finish keys. I'm going to go to view, create a new view, schedule, just like I was creating a regular old schedule. And rather than creating a schedule of building components, once I select rooms, I'm going to create a schedule of keys. Hit OK, and you can see it's going to populate just like it would a regular schedule. What fields do I want to associate to these key values? Now, for later purposes, and I'm going to demonstrate why in the future here, I'm just going to go ahead and do base and wall for now. And we can go in and we can do any kind of sorting and grouping that we would want, any formatting, etc. And you can see here also my parameter name that I was referring to earlier with the room style. If I wanted to, I could call this room finishes or any other parameter name that I'd like to give it. And it's good to kind of update this upon creation so you don't confuse others later. But you can see that by default automatically updates it to be named room style, which is fine with me for now. The biggest thing here is that we need to insert data rows. So once I insert my data row there, I can then start to populate these keys, right? So I can say for my typical office, I have the base finish of rubber base 01 and wall finish paint 01. So now I have a key, and of course I could insert as many data rows and populate as many keys as I'd like. Hey, Paul, good to see you in here. So when I come back and I select my office, so that was a little bit easier to select that room by hovering over my tag and tabbing, getting the X. You can see there, I now have the room selected. And now you can see I have the instance parameter of room style or whatever you updated it to be, right? By default, it's room style. And because I inserted a data row and created that key, I can populate office. And now my base finish, my wall finish automatically populate. And you can see I can't update them, right? They are overridden and driven by that key value. You can see, however, only those two values are updated and driven by the key. Because I didn't give the ceiling or floor finish part of that key value, I didn't insert those fields into my key schedule, they are not associated to this data row or that key value. Okay, so if I come back to my room style schedule, maybe actually I want this to be 02. Come back to my furniture layout, and you can see there, because that key is associated, it automatically updates. So that is one way to populate your room data. Now, most people come to me and they say, that's not very smart, right? You're still having to manually transcribe all of this data into those keys. We look up at my ceiling plan, you can see I have ceiling finishes already modeled, right? If I select this, it's in metric, but you can see there that I have an ACT grid modeled there. And this grid, as you can see by the surface pattern, has a material. Why can't I use that and associate that to my room? Just like my material tag would read that material, I want my room to read that material. So let's get back to PowerPoint here. If it wants to. I don't think it wants to. It likes Revit open today, apparently. And talk about room finish elements, because room data plus model elements equals happy documentation, right? You're not having to manually transcribe all of these values. Now, the key here is that these values are there to be read, right? So if, for example, I look at my ceiling and I look at the material associated to the ceiling in terms of its structure, right? So I went into the ceiling type, looked at the structure, and then came into the finish layer. You can see that the graphics tab is probably the one that you're used to in terms of the materials, right? How it renders, how it looks in Enscape, right? Which is a lot of fun. Even how that surface pattern looks, right? With the grid and all of that. But the identity tab is where all of the data is coming from, right? And that's really in terms of how we document with the legend and the schedule down the line, what we really want to make sure has data. Okay, so you can see there that I've come in and for my ceiling tile, I have added the mark value of ACT01 or whatever it is that you want to call this, right? Acoustic tile, maybe AT, whatever, right? Then we can use this data, right? Now, this is one of our parameter or one of our Dynamo scripts that I'm going to share with you guys here. But essentially, this Dynamo script is looking for elements that intersect room geometry. Now, one thing here, you have to make sure that your room is tall enough to reach that ceiling. It actually grabs the ceiling inside of there. Or you can't have an 8-foot high room and a ceiling at 10 foot. They will not intersect. Okay. But if they do intersect, you can essentially grab either the floors or the ceilings and populate those finish layer structure material mark values into the room data. Okay, so you are not having to manually transcribe it. All right, so let's do it. Now, you can also do this with a Revit schedule. A lot of people do not know this. I believe I haven't, this isn't something I demoed beforehand. But for example, if we look, you can see there's my room style schedule. If I needed to get back to my keys and I closed that out. But if I just come to my furniture schedule, for example, and you could do this with either a floor schedule or a ceiling schedule. If you come back into your fields, you can schedule available fields from the room and look at the room name and number. And if I hit OK there, you can see it tells me I have 7 chairs in the lobby. I didn't do anything special here, right? I'm just updating my Revit schedule to include room data. Okay. I'm going to have a Dynamo do that same thing, except I'm going to do this backwards, right? I'm going to tell the room what finishes it has from those elements, right? So I'm just reading the data that already exists in Revit. I'm not doing any voodoo with Dynamo, right? Just copying data that already exists within the Revit model and pasting it into those room parameters.
Hey, Dana.
Yes.
We did have a comment, and Kimberly took one of them. But Joanna asked, do you model paint and resin? And then she followed up with, I'm asking about modeling such layers because in Revit, there is a problem with material tags.
Material tags.
Material tags, okay, yeah.
I call those finishes with obsolete thickness. We're going to talk about those in 1 second. We're going to talk about painted finishes in one moment, because Revit also knows if finishes are painted. If we look at a wall schedule, which of course there isn't one here, but if we go to view, we go to schedules and we go to wall quantities or schedule of quantities, and we create a wall schedule, we hit OK. You can see that it actually has it does it here. Material as paint. Maybe it's in a material schedule. So it's probably actually a materials, material takeoff schedule, which we're actually going to get to in a second. And you can see there that it actually has materials. Let's see here. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'll talk about that in one moment. But essentially, once again, absolutely. If painted, if you're still painting it, if it's that's technically being modeled, right? You have educated the model in terms of what's happening with finishes, then that data is existing there, and Revit can connect those dots, and we can totally use that data in terms of copying it from there to there, wherever there is, right? And we'll talk about that in one moment. Great question. Really, really great question. So if we get back to the finishes here, once again, the biggest thing is that ensuring the data is populated. In the sample file, all of those materials that live in the sample file, none of those have mark values. So if we come to manage, we open up our materials, we can start to look at, paint. If we're going to use paint down here in a second, when we start to paint those walls and other surfaces, even ceilings, then we need to make sure it has a mark value so that it understands what value to copy over, right? It's not just going to mysteriously know what value to use, right? It's still within the model. So if we find our ceiling grid, I think it was like 600 by 600, right? You can come in here and you can make sure that it has your ACT 01 value. Now, one thing whenever you're updating values in here, I always suggest you click out of that parameter that you just updated and hit apply. Material dialog box is a little bit finicky. If you update a parameter and just hit OK and get out of there, a lot of times it won't catch and it won't actually update. So just a little bit of a tip there to save you a little bit of time. Sometimes, especially when you have a lot of materials reading a lot of wonderful, graphic information, this box takes a really long time to populate, right? So ACT01 in there. Maybe we also will create or update a carpet, right? So that we can create a carpet material later. CPT01. Hit OK. Save us a little bit of time. Hit apply first. Okay. Hit OK. So if you come back into, first off, our ceiling plan, right? Come into our entry level ceiling plan. First off, we'll tab over the grid, select the ceiling. If we come into the structure, you can see here that material, the ceiling tile 600, 600, that's what I just updated. That is associated to the ceiling that is modeled within the entry level within this office, right? Once again, ensuring that the room is high enough to actually reach that ceiling. They don't intersect. It's hard to actually get those dots to connect, okay? So once I've ensured that, maybe I also want to give this office or whatever this is, right? This ceiling that's plain, some values here, right? So you can see there's like a cove in here. We've got some, little storage spaces that just have a gyp ceiling, right? So I have my plain ceiling selected. I think this is just plasterboard. So we can start to give our plasterboard some mark values. Now, if you're using this to update, within your section, the mark of this plasterboard in terms of like, this is GIP 1, then, we need to be cognizant of that. Maybe, thinking about how we can use different material identity parameter values to ensure we're getting all of that value within the data. Okay, we don't want to override parameters. If this says something like GIP 01, probably a good idea to trace that down to see if it's being used somewhere. Okay, we're good here within the sample file. I'm just going to update this to be paint 01, right? So anywhere that has this ceiling, this plain ceiling here, will automatically, now I didn't follow my own advice. If I come back in here, okay, good. It latched on. Paint 01 got updated there. Anywhere that got this plain ceiling will automatically be updated to paint 01. Okay. But we'll talk about paint in terms of coming in and painting surfaces here in a second. Okay. So open up my Dynamo player. And once again, I will share this with you guys, all of these scripts here. Let's see, room finish info from finish elements. Does it level by level? Do we want to do finish from our ceiling or our floors? We're going to make sure that's on true and do our ceilings. Should tell us how many rooms get updated and what those mark values are that were pushed over to our rooms. You can see ACT 01 and paint 01. as we just updated them. Now, we don't have our rooms tagged here, but we easily could. We got to annotate, tag all, make sure we select our room tag with finishes, apply that, right? You can see there, our ACT 01, paint 01 have now been pushed. If we select our prep dish room, you can see there, paint 01 was just pushed over from the ceiling to the ceiling finish parameter to the room. Now we could do the same thing with our floor finishes. And if we just once again ensure that they're actually modeled. So we'll come in and we'll go to model a floor. Now with this, we actually need to create a carpet floor, right? That sits on top of our structural floor. Typically when I start to delineate structures from one another, right? This is a separate floor sketch from my structural floor sketch. It's because they have different boundaries, right? I'm not going to break my structural floor because my finished floor changes. It's not very wise. Oh my goodness. I didn't follow Sean's advice. And now you heard Harry Potter. That was embarrassing. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to essentially make sure that I duplicate this metal sunscreen and create a carpet finish material for my floor. Now, I do actually filter within the Dynamo script down to floors that contain the word finish, because a lot of the time we actually do break our floors this way. Just as a little side note, it will not pick up floors without finish in the type name. So we'll come in and we will update our material here to be our carpet 01, which we already updated and saved ourselves a little bit of time so that it already has a mark value. Hit OK and OK. Carpet finish with our, go ahead and make this a finish material that's not structural, just because, and we'll elevate it. Yes.
Hopefully, I have a couple of just really quick ones here.
Absolutely.
Steve Bennett said, what happens when you have ACT and gypsum board ceiling in the same room?
Very good question. It will actually concatenate those two values together and with a comma and a space and push them to that room.
Awesome.
Very, very good question. But it's really however you read the logic. You could have it where it just reads the first one and pushes it over there, or both. Could have it just where it reads just ACTs and doesn't read anything else. However you have the Dynamo script read it. As long as that room is intersecting that ceiling, it will get all of the ceilings or floors.
Awesome.
Very, very good question.
And one from Michael. Can you make the tool run automatically? My users are not responsible people. I love that.
Unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, now you can have these types of things run overnight. There are ways that you can have, tools like this run on your models. So through Clarity and other tools, I know Autodesk is working on making these much more connected in this way. So definitely something, throw up on ideas if you don't see those already. But this is a really great thing. And usually what I will tell people to add to the start page, and most of us will have a page that when our users open up, they see, has some comments on it that says, hey, before you print, these are a few good scripts to run. Make sure your data is up to date, right? Usually ones with some of our title block updaters, and update kind of the key plans and graphic scales if necessary. These types of annotative scripts that are being used, etc. So that's just a really great note, if nothing else, for yourself to know, hey, on in that 11th hour before I print, let me save me some red lines and throw these up there. But great question. And I know also Orchestra, if you guys are familiar with that tool, really, really wonderful tool, that Data Shapes, if you're familiar with that package in Dynamo Orchestra with a K, they actually have a process that allows you to automate Dynamo runs as well. So That's a great tool to look at as well. So once I model that carpet, right, gave it carpet finish within the name, made sure that that carpet material actually had the mark value that I wanted to push to the room. That's super important. And you can see it's actually sitting on top of the structural floor, right? I moved it up a little bit so it's not intersecting with the structural floor and is intersecting with the room. That's very important. And once I come in here and I update this to false, work with the floor finish for floor materials, and I run this, we should see our floor material, cross our fingers, get updated here, right? We always love live demos. There we go. So essentially, once again, using our modeled elements when possible, when they have a thickness, to actually populate back to our room typical finishes. Now, when it's painted, let me throw this guy back up here because you guys are quick. Essentially, that's when we can get into certain things like non-typical finishes, potentially. Maybe it's not, right? And we can talk about other ways of using this data. It's the same idea, right? So you can see there when it's not modeled and painted and versus when it is modeled and painted. You can see here, I'm updating a wall tag. So I'm essentially telling that wall, hey, you've been painted, have some additional information to you that I can tag, right? And schedule and all of that a little bit more easily. So essentially, we're going to use the wall comment parameter, and you could use any parameter. We actually have a shared parameter at Smith Group that we've created and use specific to this. Once again, maybe you need one for multiple, maybe you need one for the base versus the wall finish. We'll talk about limitations there. Maybe you need, and I've seen groups who like to do north, south, east, west types of things. You could add those to the room or to the walls here, right? It's really ensure that you're encapsulating the data. And so really when it comes down to it, when we document, I would always ask you, let me see a finished plan that you've produced or that, you know, your company as a standard would recommend that I follow, right? Let me see some standard documentation and how we push this stuff out. So essentially with the accent finishes, that's breaking the typical scenario, right? With our typical finishes within that space, we're adding those to the room, right? With accent finishes, we're going to do something else here. We're not adding those to the room. We're either painting them, and once again, ensuring that that material exists, right? So wall covering, for example, has an obsolete thickness, may not necessarily make a lot of sense to make a wall that's a 32nd of an inch thick floating around your project. Probably not a great idea. Would probably be highly advisable. If you do, I would definitely throw it on a work set, right? That's probably off by default, which is actually what we do for all of our finish elements at Smith Group. This is a little side note. And you can see here, in addition to the material, not only did I create that material, I gave it data. All right, so you can see they're wall covering 01. So I can come in here, I can start to paint my walls, whatever I want. And then we have walls, painted material mark. So taking the mark value from the material, that's very important. If you don't have mark values, this will not work. Right? Taking the data that already exists within our model and pushing that to something. Right? Maybe it's to the room. In this case, it's to the wall that is actually painted. So let's do that first. Let's do the painted elements. I think I'm doing pretty good here on time. So just as an example, I'm going to select this wall and throw up a selection box around it. Make sure I'm looking at the right side of it. I think I am. Just select this ceiling, make sure that we're actually looking at the right thing. And I'm not. See, let's hit why we do that check. There we go. So I want to paint this little guy right here. So in terms of this wall, maybe the best idea would actually be to split it. Now, I've also seen users who will start to split this guy vertically for our wall base. Oh, goodness me, look at that. Did not like being split like that. So actually, they will paint multiple sides of the wall. That's with split face. I apologize. So they'll select this face of this wall, if it will let me, and start to split that guy up. Now, in the case of multiple faces that have been painted, it will concatenate these values. So once again, multiple ceilings, multiple floors, multiple painted elements, whatever it is, it's how you write the logic within Dynamo to grab this data, right? Maybe you just want it to grab the first material. So it's not concatenating them all together, right? It's really however you want it to be written. So when I come up here to paint, the biggest thing here is that we actually have a material that is not only exists, but has data associated to it. Okay, now I know because I used paint. Nope, that's not true because I updated plasterboard, right, to be paint. So it's not true. So I'm going to come out of my, I'm not ready to paint because I don't have a material with data. So I'm going to come back to manage, go back to materials, and let's just go ahead and create a wall covering, right? Create new material, right click and rename him, call him wall covering 01. And the biggest thing here, once again, is that we, goodness, update the identity data, right? That it actually has a value to read, right? Not only has it been painted with this material, but it's going to use the mark value that it gets from the material, push it to the wall. And of course, you could update the graphics as well to be something cool, right? Maybe we'll just, for the sake of the legend component that we're doing in the future, give this an aluminum surface pattern. And come back, make sure that my mark stuck, just for the sake of it, hit OK. And now I'm ready to come in and paint. So I'll come back to my modify, paint, look for my new wall covering material, paint that guy. Look at that beauty. And of course, if we needed to, we could split, we could paint the base. The only thing is that it would not create, the profile for the base. We want to do that with a wall sweep, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Wall sweeps are great because you also are able to associate a material to them that can be tagged, which we'll talk about with modeled elements here in a second. So now that I've painted this wall, right, which if I select this wall here, it's just a basic wall. I haven't modeled anything. I just painted. I can now come back into Dynamo and I can go to my walls painted material mark. It's going to look at walls by level and update a a wall parameter that you specify. In this case, comments is the default. Once again, Smith Group does have a shared parameter that we use for this that we label within the tag, the wall tag. So you can see there, if I select my wall, which exists on level 1, right? You can see that this base constraint is level 1. So it will automatically update because it's reading level 1, entry level 1. You can see that if I look down at comments, there's wall covering 01, right? Once again, that wall's painted, Revit knows about it. So Dynamo just asked, hey, you're painted. What material you got painted on you? Does that have a mark value? Awesome. I'm going to copy that mark value to the wall comment. That's what they told me to do in Dynamo. So now, because that is a wall parameter, we can tag it. A little bit of a cheat, but once again, using a lot of a cheat, using that parameter data, right? That once again, already exists. We're not having to manually transcribe this. You could. You don't want to use Dynamo, or you're resistant to using Dynamo for whatever reason, which I sympathize with for whatever reason. So now we can come in and we can start to modify that tag, right? We come back to our furniture layout. You can say, hey, this painted wall right here that has the comment of WC01, we want to tag that within this room so that it's annotated, right? So we will tag under annotate, tag by category, click on this wall, and we can edit this wall tag, right? So that this wall tag is the parameter of comments. So we'll edit this family. I don't need this graphic here. I want to differentiate from my regular wall tag. Maybe you want this to be a circle. Maybe you want it to be a square. I'm not going to draw anything just for the sake of time here. I'm going to edit my label, get rid of type mark, and add in comments. And rather than creating a separate type, I'm just going to go ahead and do a file, save as, so that it has a unique name. All right, I'm just going to save this from on my desktop for right now and get rid of it later. And I'll call this finish tag finishes. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to throw comments in that name as well, so you know which parameter label is included. So now when I go back into my furniture layout where my wall tag exists, I can select that wall tag and I can change it over to my finishes tag, which once again reads the comments parameter, right? I can start to add a leader however I need to. Maybe add an arrow to this leader, which is a type parameter of tags. Start to drag this out here, and I can start to annotate that. Now, one really wonderful thing within 2023, you can actually add a host. However, you need to make sure that it's actually a separate host. It will not work if you're tagging the same element. So you can actually see I just went ahead and split that so that I have two separate elements that are being tagged. Not ideal, but better for documentation. For modeled elements, which we're going to get to next, that would be for when we actually have stuff like our carpet or our wall sweeps, like I was referring to before. In our presentation, come back in here. We actually talk about a finish wall, right? Something that doesn't have an obsolete finish or thickness like tile, right? Or metal, wood, things like that, that actually do have a thickness. You can also think about the backer that it's on. So even if you're using a wood veneer, it's got not probably, unless it's a wall covering, not going to just be hanging off the wall, right? So that would have a thickness to it that we could actually associate the material mark to. In this case, we're going to use the material tag. So let's go ahead and do that. Now with our architecture wall, same concept with our floors, right? We're essentially just going to come in here and duplicate one of our wall types, give it something smart for its name here. And update the thickness, something that makes sense as well. And then we can start to update the material values here, ensuring that it has data, right? So not only am I associating the material, also going to update the material mark value. Hit apply because I updated something in here just for safekeeping. Hit OK. And now I have a ceramic tile TL01 wall. Maybe I want to update this to finish. That isn't structural. Whatever you need to do here probably would be appreciated by your structural engineer. And we can start to model this wall the way we need to. There we go. Oh, does not like that. Does it? And maybe I draw this with finished face, interior or exterior, so that it actually gets drawn into the wall here. It doesn't like being a structural wall. Top constraint is invalid. Why isn't it letting me? Is lower. So let's see here. Entry level, we'll just go to the roof. It can't be lower. Base. What am I doing wrong here? We'll just model it. It shows. So that's not good. It doesn't show. Of course, because it's a live demo, right? What could I guess maybe I'll just give it a top.
Sample files are always fun.
Sample files, metric sample files, especially. Okay, so it's showing. That's the biggest thing here is that it's being cut within the project. I'll actually just make it a little bit taller just for safekeeping, that it's actually being cut is the biggest thing here. So when I annotate it and I go to material tag, it will read. Now, the reason it's not reading, I'm like, Dana, why are you a liar? Our material tag by default within the sample file is labeling the description. And this is always what I would do when you're like, why isn't it reading? I would just go ahead and update that tag, take a look at it. What's happening? What is it actually annotating? Not what I want. So I'm going to get rid of description. Add mark. Move that over here. Once again, another family that I have already updated for you guys. I don't need to save it. It's already saved. And we'll just make sure that it's actually hitting that guy. Now, I will say probably would benefit from it being on a fine detail level. The walls, if they are on a course, and this probably would be something also to look at, if they're not being cut, which could probably be the problem right here, right? Because I'm not very good with metric. Try to make it super tall enough, but may not be the case. And if you can actually see the layers, you're like, what do you mean by that? You see how I can actually see the layers here within this wall, the differentiation between block and, etc. So if you can see the layers, that means that you can start to tag these things. Now that would be the good reason why it's not tagging what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on my leader here. There we go. And make sure that I'm actually pointing to that incredibly thin wall that I'd like to tag. Once again, the arrowhead is part of the type with tags. So we can come in here and add an arrowhead if we would like. You can see I have this tagged a few different times here, so we'll get rid of a few of these. One other way that I see people do this, it's not my preferred way, with tagging elements more than once. You can see that I can actually move this leader around because it has a free end. That's default with material tags. Not necessarily the case with a wall tag. If you make it free end, behaves a little bit better. You can start to get a little arrow and a elbow, etc. with it. It starts to behave a little bit better for you, but a little bit trickier in terms of ensuring that thing follows what you want. One other thing that I see here is people will actually duplicate, paste, align to same place. Once again, not necessarily ideal. Maybe that's better than splitting the wall so that you can get that multiple leaders within 2023 functionality. Up to you. The beautiful thing here is because it's not text, it follows my wall. look at that. I'm moving the wall around and my tag moves with it because the tag is associated to that wall. Very, very important key. If it were text, it wouldn't be associated. That's also kind of an important thing to note with the free end. Free end won't follow as easily. So something to note there as well.
Hi, Dana. Are we at a point where we can break and wrap up? We're losing.
Absolutely.
People have got meetings, and I got one question I promised Danya I would ask.
Yep.
Can you do a finished schedule on a material schedule with percentage of material for something like exterior walls?
You can. If you look at some of the formulas that you could create, there are ways of creating formulas for percentages. We do that sometimes with our life safety spaces as well when we do classifications. So definitely something to look at. One thing with our schedule before we finish up here is I will say with Revit takeoff schedules, which we took a look at a little bit with the painted surfaces. I jumped in there a little bit. Unfortunately, they do not schedule everything. There is a limitation there with a few elements, including, unfortunately, wall sweeps. So wall sweeps will not show up on the takeoff schedule. In this case, we actually do place a generic swatch element within space. Once again, not ideal, but this will create a line item within your finished schedule. And of course, would probably be advised to be put on a finished work set that is off by default. You don't want these guys floating around everywhere. So definitely a nice little tip with our takeoff schedules. This element is also what I use with my legend. So in my legend component, I'm going to select this little swatch. And because it has the material associated to it, I can use my material tag, as you can see in the slide. And that's really the sum of it.
Awesome.
Any questions we didn't get to?
I think we got most of them in there. I mean, there was a lot of good feedback, and a few people had to jump. They had meetings at the top of the hour. But
I apologize. I guess for some reason I thought that I had a little bit longer than the top of the hour. So I apologize, guys. But thank you all so much for joining, and hopefully documentation with materials.
Don't leave yet. We've got the last two slides of mine, please.
Absolutely.
And we'll just roll through those, and we'll thank you for all your information here. Lots of good stuff. Lots of good kudos. Thanks for everybody who joined us. When you leave, there'll be a quick painless survey. It helps us figure out what you like, what we could improve, and what topics you would like to see in the future. I also pasted a whole bunch of links, helpful links to community conversations. And like I did mention, we do have 3 community conversations live at AU this year. They're all full, but if you come to the door, we might be able to sneak you in. Not everybody may make it there, or we may be able to find room to hide you in there. It'll also be online for those not attending and just going to the digital version, the Zoom. Again, thank you everybody for attending. I will post the files and the recording in the next day, and stay connected with the Autodesk community. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Dana. Love your desktop wallpaper.
Gotta keep it fun, right?
Yeah. All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great Wednesday.